Hey there, happy campers! Welcome to camp! I'm Maryell, a design principal at Education Elements, and together with my colleagues Drew and Jill, we'll be sharing why the opportunity is right for making competency-based shifts in our classrooms, schools, and districts. We'll talk you through the importance of articulating mission-critical learning for students and how you can get started putting these ideas into practice. Speaking of Drew, let's go ahead and check in with him to get us started on this learning.
Thanks, Maryell. Hi, I'm Drew Sean, Senior Design Principal at Education Elements. I'm so glad to be here with you all. In this section, Maryell and I are going to describe why a competency-based approach can provide more equitable, responsive, and student-centered classrooms in your school or your district. I want you to close your eyes for a minute. Picture this. You're a 4th grade math student, sitting in class, struggling to grasp the concept of adding and subtracting fractions. Your teacher's provided you with some extra support, but you don't have enough class time to really engage in productive struggle with the concept. Before you know it, the class has moved on to multiplying fractions, and you're still getting the numerator and the denominator confused. And by the time you think you might have a hold on the concept of adding and subtracting fractions, the class has moved on to a unit on measuring angles. Sound familiar?
The learning gaps that Drew just described are all too common among our students. If they miss a foundational concept and it's time to move on, we're setting them up for a losing battle as they continue to progress through concepts in lockstep with the rest of their class. And it doesn't just apply to falling behind in a single subject. Now picture yourself as a high school history student and you've been tasked with writing an argumentative essay on whether the US should have entered World War I as an end-of-unit exam. You happen to be a total history buff and can talk about Franz Ferdinand, the Lusitania, and the Zimmermann telegram until the cows come home. But rather than have the opportunity to demonstrate that knowledge and move on to new concepts or to deepen your learning, you sit through the same learning as your potentially less interested peers.
When we fail to grant more flexibility with time, honor students' unique needs and interests, and focus on teaching content with little relevance to students and their personal experience or the goals that they have for the future, we run a substantially higher risk of them checking out of the learning process altogether. Competency-based learning does away with a rigid timetable in favor of a more fluid period of learning where students are able to progress at their own pace. This ensures that content mastery is the constant and time is the variable, not the other way around, as it is evident in a more traditional learning environment. And when students have mastered content and can show what they know, they can advance to new learning. This allows students to have more opportunities to channel their goals and interests into the learning experience, tap into their preferred learning styles, and not rely on arbitrary seat time requirements to be the determining factor of whether they've learned something or not.
Our education system was designed, intentionally or not, to yield the results we see today in a traditional learning model. But the good news is that because they were designed, our systems can be redesigned. And in doing so, we can work to create a more equitable system that honors the unique talents, identities, and abilities of all students. A competency-based approach allows us as learning experience designers to make these shifts more purposefully and intentionally, elevating the student experience and being more responsive to their needs.
Remember the 2 examples that we shared earlier? Think about how we might be able to flip the script if we first allowed those 2 students to progress at their own pace towards mastering content. And also consider how distilling the learning process down into its most important objectives could streamline the schooling experience to be more purposeful and more powerful. While these possibilities are exciting, it takes a thoughtful approach, authentic stakeholder engagement, and evidence-driven continuous improvement to actualize how CBE do you want to be. In the next 2 videos in this pathway, you'll learn more in-depth knowledge about the role that competencies can play in the learning experience.
We're curious to hear from you. What part about the potential to make competency-based shifts in your school or district excites you the most? And why are you embarking on this journey in the first place? Let us know in the chat.
Stick with me for the next leg of our journey. Jill and I are going to be sharing with you exactly what we mean by competencies, and how are they different from what students are learning right now. Maryell, we'll see you in a bit. In our last video, we explored the rationale behind making competency-based shifts in your school or district to make learning more responsive to student needs. Competency-based education focuses not just on providing flexibility with time to ensure students can demonstrate mastery over their learning, but also more intentionality behind articulating what students should know and be able to do at the completion of a particular learning journey. These mission-critical skills, knowledge, and abilities manifest themselves through competencies, without which we wouldn't have CBE.
Exactly. Distilling learning into its most essential components is crucial for streamlining the learning experience. Not only does it allow the students to clearly articulate what they are learning, but why it's important to their future.
We often get asked the question, how is a competency different from a standard? Simply put, standards are discrete descriptions of what students should be able to do in relation to established criteria, often by a state or local education agency. They essentially serve as the building blocks for competencies, which take standards a step further and describe how students should apply their learning and transfer that learning to new and novel contexts. Competencies can be comprised of multiple standards, are revisited multiple times through the learning experience, and also allow for the transfer of knowledge and skills across academic disciplines.
We also often get the question, what's the difference between standard-based learning and competency-based learning? The best response we've heard is from Chris Strugus, who has said, perhaps the most important difference of all between standard-based learning and competency-based learning is the commitment to the student. In standard-based systems, standards set a consistent target for teaching, but in practice, there is no specific commitment that all students achieve the target. Essentially, this means that students might be held to the same standards, yet they may advance to new learning without mastering previous content. Competency-based learning, however, is dependent on mastery learning, not seat time or what is dictated on a calendar.
That is a really good point, Jill. It's one thing to set common outcomes for all students, but another entirely to hold students accountable to master that learning. Competencies focus on the application of learning rather than just the content knowledge itself. In a competency-based system, it's not enough for a student to be able to rely on information recall alone. Rather, students will demonstrate their learning according to mastery of competencies that provide the opportunity for application and synthesis of knowledge. Competencies can also encompass cross-cutting, transferable skills that can be applied in a number of different situations and contexts. In theory, the skills that are described in a competency will be valuable many years from now, even when the content knowledge itself has maybe changed a little bit.
Let's take a look at some examples of competency-based learning so you can see what we mean. In this example, from the state of New Hampshire for high school English language arts, we can see that this particular competency is a collection of skills and standards that support a student's ability to demonstrate mastery in writing arguments. It is relatively broad in scope and transferable to a number of novel contexts, not exclusive to ELA. However, it is backed by English language arts standards. To take this a step further, a district might make more explicit connections to these competencies and their portrait of a graduate, so a student knows the big picture for why writing arguments will help them succeed in the future.
Here's another example from the Sanborn Regional School District for K-8 mathematics that dials in a little bit deeper. You can see in this example that the district has articulated a competency around measurement that they're going to hold all students accountable to from grades K through 12. This example also shows how a competency can be broken down into grade-span sub-competencies to chart out a progression towards mastery that's developmentally appropriate for each set of grades. Here we can see how focusing on specific aspects of the measurement competency in kindergarten through second grade serves as a foundation for continued and deeper learning as students progress through later grades. These grade-level competencies are then supported by learning objectives that show up more explicitly from day to day during class time.
Seeing these examples really gets me to think about the student learning experience, Drew. Knowing what I'm learning, why I'm learning, and how it connects to my future gets me excited about the learning process. For teachers as well, it provides clarity of why the content is important and ties to the big picture.
I agree, Jill. It's really exciting to think about the ways in which we can start to streamline the learning experience to make it more meaningful and sensical for a variety of stakeholders. And that's getting me to wonder from you all watching, have you experimented with this idea of mission critical or streamlined learning in your school or district? If so, how? If not, what are you excited to try? Let us know in the chat.
We hope you are as excited about the possibilities that exist when applying a competency-based framework to structure and organizing learning for students. Join Maryell and I on our last stop on our competency-based journey as we talk about the ideas that you can put into practice right away. Thank you, Drew, for joining us. We'll see you around the campfire. Together, we talked about the importance to shift to a competency-based learning to best meet the students' needs and what competencies might look like to facilitate that process. Now, let's dive into how you can take the learnings and get started in your district.
I'm back, and so good to join you, Jill. As we touched on earlier, a primary principle of a competency-based system is designing with the end in mind, or backwards design. In other words, what are the desired learning outcomes you want students to be able to walk away with at the end of the day? And what potential steps need to be taken in order to help a student get to where they need to be? Just like climbing up a mountain, you need to know where you're going before you figure out how to get there. The same is true in a competency-based environment.
A portrait of a graduate is an ideal starting point when thinking about making competency-based learning shifts because it allows you to clearly articulate the qualities that are important to you as a school or district that relates to what the student should know and be able to do by the end of a learning experience. While they're typically written for outcomes of a 12th grader, the term graduate can be used loosely. You can start with any grade level. For example, a portrait of a 5th grader.
A competency-based learning environment is deeply connected to the community in which it operates. So making time and space for others to weigh in on what graduates should know and be able to do is essential to making sure your graduate profiles are reflective of the people who make up your community. Gathering this input might take the form of one-on-one interviews, focus groups, or community town halls. If you're looking for more guidance or resources to structure these opportunities to include the community in your portrait of a graduate authoring process, be sure to check out our Equitable Inclusion Guide for tips on making that experience as powerful and inclusive as possible.
Great call out, Maryell. The guide provides great guidance on purposefully structuring conversations with all stakeholders. I think it's important to call out when you get started, your portrait might start off in pencil instead of pen, and you might refer to it as a sketch versus a full-blown portrait. When you are ready to take the first steps in sustaining and maintaining a high-fidelity, competency-based learning environment, though, all stakeholders need to be clear on what is expected of students. Eventually, it will be important to be explicit on calling out the connections about what the students are learning on a day-to-day basis and why that will help them actualize the portrait of a graduate.
We're curious to know, have you created a portrait of a graduate for your district? How are you using it to make learning experiences more purposeful and connected for students? Let us know by responding in the chat. And better yet, drop a link to your district's portrait of a graduate so we can take a look. As you're doing that, here's an example from Stamford, Connecticut. We've had the pleasure of working with Stamford Public Schools, Anchor at Harbor Landing to develop their portrait of a graduate and use it as an anchor, pun intended, for our competency-based redesign work with them. As you can see, these graduate outcomes are broad, holistic, and multifaceted. Qualities of a graduate of Anchor in this example will demonstrate a variety of skills, knowledge, and abilities to be successful in their future.
Great example, Maryell. Once you have completed the portrait of a graduate, it's time to start thinking about the mission-critical learning that actualizes that portrait. In other words, what competencies are students working towards mastery in their day-to-day learning? As a reminder, these competencies should be a cross-cutting collection of standards that can be applied to a variety of contexts and situations. They also should be accompanied by a performance criteria that allows students to identify their performance level and where they can make improvements.
If you are interested in getting started authoring competencies, start by selecting one course, grade level, or subject area. sit down with members of your team or department and take a look at the standards associated with your chosen domain. You might write them all down on sticky notes and place them on a whiteboard or common surface. Begin to affinity group them and see where trends are emerging. How might you label certain collections of standards and skills?
Then, take a closer look at that standard or skill and assess the degree that that standard or skill is mission critical for students' future of learning. This is the time to think critically if it's important for what students need to know. Where should teachers be spending most of their time teaching? Ideally, it should be on those subjects and topics that are closely connected to the portrait of a graduate.
It's important to note that this process will take time, but it's an important first step in solidifying a competency-based foundation for your school or district. By being clear, intentional, and strategic about the learning we want students to take part in, we can craft more equitable learning experiences that prepare all students for success, while also allowing for ample opportunities for students to bring more of themselves to their learning.
We hope your gears are turning and you have sparked new ideas as we close out this portion of camp. Let us know in the chat what you are thinking and what you're most excited to dig into. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We encourage you to join me, Maryell, and the Education Elements team as we discuss around the campfire ideas you learned, things you want to share, and commitments of how you're going to put this into practice.
This has been a blast. Thanks so much for joining us. And see you around the campfire. Who's hungry for some more competencies?